it sits almost completely in half, or currently almost completely in half, but bounding the western part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe. And obviously that's why they're fighting over it. It's also pretty flat, and of its history, people have crossed it and conquered it in both directions and against each other all the time. And let me give you an example. This, can you see the pointer? Would you raise your hand if you see the pointer? Yeah, great.
Yes.
This is Lviv. That's a city near Poland. My grandfather was born in Lviv, but my grandfather was born in a city called Lemberg in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the turn of the century. My grandfather immigrated to the United States in 1933 with a Polish passport. And today, my grandfather, were he alive, would be very surprised to find out he's Ukrainian. So the borders that they're fighting over are not borders that have been very long, and that's part of the problem. In 1920, Polish troops entered Kyiv and had a war with Russia. And let me go back to this. That allows you to understand that there are Russian-speaking and Russian-leaning people on the eastern side, and there are Western-leaning and Ukrainian-speaking people, majority on the western side. Kyiv, which is the capital, identifies itself with the West. But pieces of this, the story I just told you about my grandfather, were parts of the end of the Second World War. So this is the former Poland given to Ukraine. And down here is Crimea, which Russia gave to Ukraine in 1954. So if they gave it to them in 1954, they had a change of mind in 2014 and said, oh no, we want it back. So lots of what you're hearing about is that these boundaries, which people are now fighting over, are the boundaries that have been contested and moved around many times. The people who then turned toward the West, because the West was much more prosperous, and because, well, let me go back to Holodomor. When Stalin and when the Soviet Union existed in Ukraine, there was an intentional starvation. It's called the Holodomor. It's not anything we understand very well, though now finally there's a statue in Washington, D.C. But part of the very deep anger and hatred toward Russia, for those who are angry and hate Russia, but that's not everyone, is that Stalin intentionally starved peasants on the Eastern Front and then replaced them with Russian nationals, so that the eastern part of the country has people that were in the 30s resettled, and they are Russian nationals. The big revolutions toward the West began in 2004, called the Orange Revolution. And in 2014, there was a Maidan Revolution, which is when I enter Ukraine. And that is because there's a Russian puppet at the head of government who refuses to do what he promised, which is to sign papers that ally Ukraine more firmly to the West. In 2014, this revolution is successful, puts in Western-leaning presidents, and at that moment, the Museum of the Maidan begins, and our friends begin to collect evidence of the of the Western-leaning revolutionary sense. But at that moment, exactly, the Russians start to invade on the east, and they take Crimea back, and they start to invade all the eastern provinces, which you hear a lot about. So this moment, which is a revolution in Kyiv that takes 90 days, turns the official government of Ukraine toward the west, and Russia invades Ukraine at that moment. And until 2022, that war continued on the Eastern Front. So that's what you need to know, that this is not a long history of stable edges of a country, and that it's a long internal conflict between the East and the West, and that from geopolitical terms, Russia has always coveted the return of Ukraine because of its very useful location, but also its grain production, and the West has long coveted their Western-leaning parts. So let me stop there and turn it over to my friend Linda, who will talk about what it then feels like to be actually in Ukraine and work in the cultural sector.
All right. Hi, everybody. I should say what I do now, which is a little bit relevant. Julie gave a little bit of the introduction. I'm a senior specialist in methodology and practice for the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. We are the only global organization that uses history and memory, working with our members, museums, historic sites, archives, and memory initiatives to create a more just future. So we think not only about the past, but about the future. But I first came to Ukraine almost 13 years ago, also as a Fulbright scholar in Kyiv. I taught at the university there and did workshops all over Ukraine. And since that first very cold January arrival, before the pandemic, had been back to Ukraine almost every year for one project or another. So, and I was lucky enough to be able to do projects and work with people all over the country, including places like Crimea, now under Russian control, and Donetsk, now held by separatists / Russia. So I got a big sense of the country when I first came. And there have been some interesting evolutions in that decade or more that I've been really lucky to be able to see as we think about culture. First of all, part of it is about who's Ukrainian. When I first came and people would talk about Ukrainians, because I have an American perspective, I was like, oh yeah, like everyone who lives in Ukraine, right? That's what you mean. And it was like, no, we mean ethnic Ukrainians. Other people, Russians, Hungarians in one part of the country, Crimean Tatars in Crimea, a very small, still existing or resettling Jewish population, they were not considered Ukrainian. It was all about ethnic identity. And you would visit museums all over the country, and they'd be very proud of their sections, because there'd been some survey done that's like, we have 15 ethnic groups in our city, and there'd be like one little case for each ethnic group with like a dress and a piece of food and, a plastic food or whatever. And it was never a sense of a national identity. One of the things that started with Maidan was the idea, because several of the people, and 100 or so people, were shot and killed during the Maidan protests, that some of those people were not ethnic Ukrainians. The very first person killed was Armenian Ukrainian. And there became a changing sense, that identity was not ethnic, but perhaps national. Which is a huge shift in the country. At the same time, institutions, 12 years ago, many people running institutions, still to this day, to some degree, worked in museums under the Soviet system. The Soviet system was very explicit that museums were propaganda vehicles. In legislation, that's how museum works. As one of my students from my first year said, when we were told Poles were bad, every museum had to do exhibits about how bad Poles were. And there was a distinct suppression of all kinds of cultures that were not Russian. And this took it took lots of different forms, but there are entries from people who observed museum professionals coming from Moscow to destroy Ukrainian objects. As well, many Ukrainian and other objects went to Moscow and St. Petersburg, other countries. One of the very first times I was in Crimea, Crimean Tatars are a group of people. They're a Muslim people. They were entirely forcibly deported to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, I think, in the 40s, and returned as soon as Ukraine became independent and have resettled. One of the very first questions a Crimean Tatar man who I'd never met before, when he heard I worked with museums, asked if I could help him get their things back from Moscow. So this ongoing work to erase the culture exists in every kind of way. It exists in the ways in which many Ukrainian artists over time have always been described in the West as well as Russian. Kazimir Malevich is described as Russian, although he's very clearly Ukrainian. All kinds of other people. It's about the language, as Elaine mentioned. It's about the way monuments worked. Baba Yar, which is the site in Kyiv where the Nazis shot and killed, this was before concentration camps, 30,000, I think, people in a weekend. There was a huge Soviet monument there, but it made no mention of Jews. It just talked about the killing of Soviet citizens. And so there was this sense, this push to make everyone Soviet, and the Soviets always talked about a family of nations, but as someone else said in the terms of a project, that family of nations always meant that Russia was at the top, and all the many, many different nations within the USSR were subsidiary to what Russia wanted. So the history of Soviet control, and then the sense about what are we going to do, Maidan really upended that in all kinds of interesting ways. It was incredible to me to watch from afar. I was not in Ukraine then. All of a sudden, directors of museums were out on the barricades. My students were all out. And the sense was that everybody had a part to play. And I see that as a significant change in the way the culture worked. You weren't waiting for someone from above to tell you what to think, what to do. As somebody else said to me at one point when we were interviewing them, it became clear at Maidan that it was just down to us. And I think that's also very true in culture now in terms of how people have reacted to the war. I can talk more about that, but Elaine, weigh in.
So let me do some setting up about the Maidan Revolution. And both Linda and I have worked together in Ukraine and separately. My role in Ukraine is I'm the senior consultant to the Museum of the Revolution of the Maidan. I was sent by the United States government 3 months after the revolution happened. But the revolution itself is really interesting, I think, to Americans because it has a shape and a form that's known to Ukraine, but it's not the way in which we protest. So, as you know, Ukraine is very cold. The Maidan is a place. Consider it Times Square of New York. It is the center of Kyiv. It was occupied peacefully, but because it's cold, the occupation immediately was about a tent city. So a tent city and tires took out out of circulation in the capital city of a country, Times Square. And it was Christmas time, and Ukraine often in the Maidan has very big rock and roll concerts and other things. So it had towers and broadcasting equipment, which is often there, was there. And they started to broadcast and live stream their revolution. And the revolution looked like Occupy Wall Street. And if any of you have studied that, they had a university, they had kids' programs, they had food kitchens, they had a kind of utopia, and everybody was peaceful except the center of the city was now occupied. At the end of 3 months, when Yaрошenko, the then puppet president of Ukraine, decided that's enough of that, he ambushed peaceful citizens, and about 100 people were killed in a very short period of time. But because they were broadcasting this and live streaming it, and people were watching a live revolution of peaceable citizens, so a little like Black Lives Matter, there was a public outrage. And at that public outrage, all nations entered, and Yaрошenko, for a number of reasons, fled overnight. And he fled to Russia with the spoils of his place. But more importantly to you, on the first day of the revolution, our friends, the culture workers, who wanted to make sure that the world understood about them and about Ukraine, went to a store and bought stickers and began to put stickers on the Maidan encampment where they were, because culture workers were in there. And the stickers said, please save this for the future museum of the Maidan. Because in Ukraine, public pop-up demonstrations of cultural and memorializing is part of the tradition. And while in America we know little about memorializing, people get killed on the side of the road and we put up little statues and you can remember that. This kind of public demonstration of public memorializing is not anything I'd ever seen before. And our friends create pop-up exhibitions overnight. If you're hearing barking, that's my dog. I'm sorry. Let me see if I'll carry on. So one of the things that you need to know is that as this war is going on, our friends, our museum people everywhere are collecting and illustrating and producing in the midst of the war exhibitions about the war. And while I find that unbelievably, we don't produce exhibitions in America without long thinking and long after the event. They created beautiful exhibitions immediately and now, and they collect simultaneously with the war. Our friends are in after the bomb detectors, collecting for the future museum of this war, which will become incorporated into the Museum of the Maidan. Over to you.
Yeah, so I just this morning came across my social media feed, talk about the kind of destruction that's been happening and a little more about the kind of work people are doing, particularly in terms of kind of self-support. So today, as of today, UNESCO has verified at least 221 cultural sites that have been damaged since Russia's invasion. 98 religious sites, 78 buildings of historical artistic interest, 18 monuments, 17 museums, and 10 libraries. And that's, of course, not including the vast destruction of entire cities, all over, and the regular attacks on power plants. But as you can see, there is this part of what's been interesting is there's been both the local Ukrainian effort to document, and they have been assisted and joined by all kinds of other international institutions, as they have in kind of every aspect of the war. Part of what is so interesting about right now is that museums continue to work. The Hanyenko Museum in Kyiv is literally on the street, on a tiny little narrow street, across from a park where a missile hit in Kyiv maybe a month or so ago. Their windows were all blown out. Within 3 days or so, they had replaced the windows. They continue, all of the artwork had already been moved, thankfully, so it was safe. But they continued to do programs. They do programs for adults. They do programs for children. The Literature Museum in Kharkiv held their literary festival in a blackout, in a bomb shelter, so people could be safe, but people gathered together to talk about literature and read. So the ongoing work of museums still continues. Some people have left Ukraine. So many museum workers have stayed, and they have stayed often at some, and many of them have also gone into military service, many cultural professionals as well. Just this week, I read about an archaeologist who was killed while in the army, and a children's book author, quite well known, who was taken prisoner in March and was just identified as having been killed by DNA. So there are the risks to institutions. The art museum in Kherson, as Russia left Kherson, the city, they abandoned it after occupying it. They literally went to the museum and took every piece of art and every archaeological artifact back to Crimea, back to Russia. That museum is empty now. Those collections are gone. And so I think so people continue to work. Ukraine is just working with ICOMOS and ICOM, I think. Ukraine has just published a red list booklet, which is something that's produced to alert the world about objects that might be trafficked from Ukraine. They have produced one from the Balkans earlier this year, and that's a way of letting the world know. And Ukrainians have been, as in the exhibit that was there, just this week or last, an exhibit opened at a museum in Spain that was, they actually managed to, at some risk, I'm sure, get Ukrainian work from the kind of modernist work from the 20s to the 60s, I think, out, and a major exhibition has just opened in Spain. So the Ukraine's work, I think, is from Zelensky on down, is kind of twofold. One, to protect their country, to ensure the heritage is protected, but two, to tell all of the rest of us about it. So I think that work is ongoing in ways that's hard for any of us to imagine. And there are two particular projects that we want to make sure we mention that are Ukrainian-run projects, that are support projects. One is called, and I'll post them both in the chat. One is the Museum Crisis Center. It was actually started by a couple of young museum professionals who thought there was a need to assist both museums and individuals in need. They started it really quickly, I think in March. They have now assisted dozens of individuals, because that's a really important part of assistance, and dozens of museums. Museums right now previously had been looking for storage crates and things like that to put their collections safely in storage and out of harm's way. Now, many of them are seeking generators, because if you read the news at all, you notice that there's all over Ukraine, there's a lack of power. HARI, the Heritage Emergency Response Initiative, another project started by a dear friend and colleague of ours, is really about getting those kind of collections care resources, packing material, crates, generators, all kinds of things. And both of them are also sharing kind of knowledge exchange as well. So those are two, and those projects, I think really importantly, are both done and run by Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine. So it's clear that when you donate to those projects, that is really incredible support. Elaine.
So let's talk about how do we know this? The Ukrainian friends we have are still on Facebook. They still have working phones. We never know how long that will last, but they do. We speak to them. And if you're listening to us and trying to figure out what you can do in a time of incredible chaos and war, though they seem very, very well organized, what you can do is find out a person you know and trust who knows a person they trust in Ukraine and help them. You can help big established organizations as well. World Food Kitchen is one I always recommend because they really are on the ground. But we, Linda and I, help people directly because you never know what they need. As you would imagine, we went immediately when the war started and went to our friends and said, can we get you out? And they said no. So one of the things that you could be asking yourself, whether in that circumstance you would choose to stay. As the email came back to me, I look forward to visiting you as a tourist. I am not coming to you as a refugee. This notion of staying and fighting in the country is deeply ingrained and is part of this cultural view of themselves and the protection of their culture. We're going to stop in about, I don't know, one more round, and you can ask questions. And I'm hoping you have questions about what it is like to make individual decisions to stay in a country and completely help to protect the cultural identity of the country itself. And I understand you are studying art history or art appreciation. Can you imagine that somebody makes a decision that it is worth the life and the life of their family to stay there to protect the art appreciation within the country itself? It boggles my mind. I'm not sure what I personally would do, but that is in fact what is going on with the people that we know. Linda, one more round and then we'll open it. And I hope people are ready to ask us questions, and we are certainly excited to answer them.
Let's see. We talked about individual efforts. I think there's something really interesting and important happening in Ukraine now, which is a kind of civic nationalism. When I first went to Ukraine, and I would talk about volunteers because, volunteers are a deeply embedded part of American life for every kind of organization. People would just look at me like I was crazy. They were like, why would you volunteer? And I was like, well, and part of what you see now, and it started with Maidan and then it continued to happen, was a sense that everyone had a contribution to make. And that's so much clearer now in the war. So some people are contributing by packing art and storing it. Other people are contributing. Museums are hosting places where you can come and make camouflage nets because the army needs them. Other people are baking bread. Other museums, including some in Poland, became refugee housing and open daycare for kids. And so I think that there is incredibly now this sense that everyone has a responsibility, but that it's up to you to figure out what your own responsibility is. And so many of the people we know, their responsibility is to the culture, but there's many, many other people whose responsibility goes to different things. And all of it is contributing to not only eventually winning the war, which we both deeply believe will happen, but also to this sense of building a nation. Ukraine has not been an independent nation for very long, 20 years, however many years. That's not that long, 30 years, I guess, at this point. And so this act of individual acts as nation building in culture and in every other part is kind of incredible. So that's my, and enough to say that we deeply, deeply, deeply admire our friends and colleagues and everyone else in Ukraine. So that I guess should go without saying, but I always feel like I need to say it. Questions from anybody?
Well, before you do that, I have one other stage setting for you guys. I know that you all use your phones. I have many grandchildren your age. One of the most important things that I learned about Ukraine and about all the things that we've talked about is that in the days in which you use your phone, the infrastructure of the phone itself is what has allowed them to stay in touch with each other, to stay in touch with the Western world. That social media itself is a tool of internal safety. That's how they talk to each other. And that regardless of how frivolous you use your phone for, the very infrastructure of the phone, of social media, of the internet is what allowed the Maidan to happen, which was coordinated completely on the internet, and which is allowing the internal support system of Ukraine to happen. So look at your phone the next time you pick it up to talk to anybody, and look at it with some new admiration. Questions for everybody?
Someone must have a question.
What are you surprised at? What did we say that you didn't know? Ah, come on. Otherwise, we can go home early.
Yulia, questions from you?
Yes, we have one student who has a question.
Okay, great.
And then me, yes.
Okay.
You got it? Oh, you were muted, so you couldn't really hear the noise here in the auditorium. Not that there was a ton of noise. But the first question was, how do you feel about going back to Ukraine? Are you planning to return to Ukraine?
Both of us are planning to return the minute we're allowed in. And both of us, because of our work in Ukraine, will probably be sent in when it's safe from a soft diplomacy point of view. We are not the only ones that's true for. There's probably hundreds of us, but yes, we and they know that. I mean, we say that all the time. We look forward to going back as soon as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not quite as important as the people who are going now. So
yeah,
it'll be a little while yet. So many ancient churches haven't been destroyed. Is that, or is it have, and that's a typo, Maria? Do you see foreseeable rebuild in the future? I would say in a general way, the government has been very, very clear about that they will rebuild everything. That means a lot of different things. I think culture and the rebuilding of some of those places will not be as high a priority as rebuilding housing and other kinds of infrastructure needs. So I think things will be rebuilt. Just as an example from a different time, St. Michael's Cathedral in Kyiv, which sits at the opposite end of a plaza from St. Sophia, which is an ancient spot. St. Michael's was torn down in the 1930s by the Soviets. Because why? Because religion was not a part of Soviet life. It was torn down. It was totally destroyed, intentionally, not in a war, just torn down. Pretty quickly after Ukraine became independent, they rebuilt that church It now serves as a really important symbol of Ukrainian identity. That's where the church bells rang, summoning people to Maidan during the protests. When the shooting started on Maidan, the church itself, the sanctuary, became essentially a morgue. So
Also an operating theater.
Operating theater.
They used the communion location to do surgery.
And so I think Ukrainians are familiar and dedicated to the idea of rebuilding.
Yeah, and the stuff that's being preserved now, so when they go in afterwards, that stuff will be returned to families. That's all being packed as new stuff, or will be donated to the museum. It's being documented now, so that the history is not lost. And let me say a word about religious structures. Like everything else in Ukraine, the church infrastructure is itself contested. There are Ukrainian churches and there are Russian churches. And so as symbols of war and struggle in the way the country has struggled, the churches themselves, the first question you would be asked to go to a church is, where is your allegiance in terms of even though the religious practice is probably the same. Anyone else? Julia?
Kanye, what?
Yeah, well, the Russian army would like go there and engage
If the Russian army would go where?
yeah, like if they like invaded the US, like would they say like
Would Americans stay or would they? Oh, these two women.
yeah.
So if we in the United States were invaded by Russians, well, she's in Puerto Rico, so she's pretty safe, but the person.
No, I'm not necessarily saying.
Yeah, Puerto Rico's a part of the US, so
Well, okay.
reminder.
No,
So is the question, would we stay?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer. The
Uh,
question, Linda you have to know different things about us. I'm a Jew. My family are immigrants from Germany. That's why my grandfather was in Lviv. And I think of myself as a peripatetic person. And if America was less
I mean, the
democratic,
person who
I
moves
wouldn't
around a
stay
lot.
either.
You think of your
So,
person who moves a lot anyway.
yes.
Yes.
So yeah, my story is different with Revolutionary War ancestors in my family. So we've been here a while. I would hope I would stay. I think there are incredible lessons about bravery that I have learned from my colleagues in Ukraine. So I see a great question. Do you think we'll ever have the stolen artifacts returned to Ukraine, as a lot of the Nazi stolen art has been found and returned to the rightful owners? Russia is one of the very few, if only, countries who has been totally unwilling to return any Nazi era art. It is full in collections. They are determined to keep it. So I suspect that unless there's some drastic changes in Russia, that will not be happening either. Interestingly, I met someone a couple of weeks ago at a conference who had worked at a museum in the Netherlands when when Maidan started and the Russia took Crimea. An exhibition of Crimean Scythian gold, ancient Crimean artifacts, was in the Netherlands.
Right.
Ukraine wanted it back, saying it was state property. Russia said, no, we control Crimea now, we want it. That art is still in the Netherlands, and the Dutch are determined. It's working its way through a legal system in the Netherlands about who owns it, but it has seemed pretty clear over time that the inclination of the Dutch is that it will be returned to Ukraine eventually.
So I think this class might not be completely cognizant of the fact that the Nazis confiscated a lot of art during the Second World War, and that it has been an issue, especially since the 1980s on, to return that art. But we did brush on it when we talked about the Bauhaus and how the Bauhaus was discredited by the Nazis and how the people who taught at the Bauhaus had to flee. I did show you an exhibit of degenerate art where people lined up to see art that had been confiscated. We talked about that some in class. Can I ask you, Linda, one more time to list the actual name of the organization that you work for? It was so long.
It is so long. It's the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. And I'm putting their website right in the link in the chat.
Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Of
what?
Sites, like places of conscience.
Yep.
Good and bad conscience.
We have 350 or so members around the world in 67 countries, including Ukraine. And as we said, we are about thinking about how the past can be used to shape a more just future.
Sites of conscience is a really interesting phrase, I think. And I think Kanye's question was referring also to maybe this reference of how brave are people to stay where they are when something happens, or do people leave? A lot of people want to leave this country because Trump was president, you know? That's something that I've heard from people. And I always think, you know, dig your heels in. You have to fight for what you believe in, no matter what side you're on. But fighting, let's hope it never comes to blows in this country in that sense.
But I do want to say that I've worked for the coalition, I don't know, 5 or 6 years at this point, and our members around the world come from incredibly different kinds of situations. In Latin America, a lot of our members are museums that were founded after the end of the dictatorships. So those museum founders and staff members are often people who were imprisoned and tortured by the dictatorships. That actually is true of our members in the Middle East. We have members in places like Haiti, where it is very, very difficult to be right now. So there is, you know, I am lucky enough to get to see examples of courage every day in my work, no matter what. And that's true for this country as well. We have 2 new members at the coalition who are, one in Texas and one in South Carolina, that are both social justice organizations looking to reframe former Ku Klux Klan halls into centers for history and justice. So courage is everywhere.
Yeah, and let me make a distinction between courage and staying. Staying in Ukraine is a source of national pride, though millions resettle in Ukraine for periods of time, and millions left Ukraine to flee to Poland and have come back. So staying is not the only brave option. These are all different organizational times. There are examples of setting up governments in other places which are the democratic hubs of the place that's now under stress. So what I want to leave with you is that for the Ukrainians, the protection of their nation is involved with staying in their nation and protecting the borders, at the same time that they are aware that the nation itself is so young that it was not so in the life of living humans. So that America's borders have been stable, certainly since the Civil War. And one could say because the Civil War did not result in the breaking apart of America for more than 200 years. We are talking about borders in which in 1945, Russia gave them Crimea, or 54, they gave them Crimea, and now they want it back. So that's in the lifetime of your parents. That's a different notion about what staying means, though staying also has very much social advantage within the country. If you would leave the country, your social credibility would also be damaged. So I don't want you to go away romanticizing this, that these are complicated times with complicated issues.
And to also just kind of to follow up on that, to kind of say, there's a lot of factors why people left Ukraine. Many people left. If you had young children, you might have made the choice to leave. We know other people who stayed, but sent their children abroad, not knowing when they would see them again. If, however, as some of you are, I think from looking at you from afar, if you're a male between 18 and 60, you can't leave the country, except with very special permission. But because you're of military service age, that same rule does not exist for women, although kind of unrelatedly to museums, but interesting in terms of lots of other ways. A high percentage of, an unusually high number of women are fighting in the armed forces in Ukraine, which has also been, it's a pretty male-oriented culture in many ways, and I think that will be an interesting shift for everyone to learn more about as time goes on.
It's a country that at the same time as fighting a war is inventing itself. And so complexity is very important to me. This notion not all people on the right side are good all the time, and not all people on the wrong side, however you define that, are bad all the time. This is a complex position. So male-oriented, your notion of gender and gender fluidity is not a comfortable issue in Ukraine. Your notion of the rights of women is not a completely comfortable issue, though in certain ways more comfortable than in America. So this is an evolving nation in the same way that we are an evolving nation. But these distinctions that we've made are the ones that strike us as particularly brave and worth watching.
Any final questions, anybody?
I'm boggled. My mind is boggled by the idea of going in after the bomb sniffing dogs and collecting artifacts that will be someday presented in a museum. Just the diversity of these materials must be incredible that they're collected.
And not only someday presented in a museum, presented last week in an exhibition. I mean, that's the other thing you should be boggled at. Yeah. There are exhibitions fully designed, completely beautiful exhibitions produced in bombed out centers by people under warfare at the same time that open to the public. That's where my mind is boggled.
It would be great to see some photographs of some of these things.
They exist. We should be able to send them to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Our class time is running to an end very soon. We might have time for one more question or so.
Well, we're very grateful. Thank you for inviting us. And I hope this has been helpful to your understanding of a current world event.
And Elaine, I put both our emails in the chat room. Because we are always happy to hear from people with questions or comments or more information. So please don't hesitate. Students as well, everybody, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
And if you didn't know that before, you should know now. We like each other and we like to work with each other. So thank you very much, Linda.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Thank you.